I rebuilt my husband's failing family business for 18 years. When we divorced, they said I'd never work there. At the mediation, 4 months into my divorce, my husband's solicitor slid a single sheet of paper across the table and said, in the flat, pleasant voice of a man reading a weather report, "For clarity, Mrs. Bellingham has never been a shareholder, director, or employee of Hartwell & Sons Limited. She has no contract of employment, has never drawn a salary from the company, and does not appear on any statutory register. Her involvement is best characterized as informal assistance to her husband's family business." There is no claim here. Informal assistance, 18 years. I had walked into that company when it was 4 months from insolvency, and I left it turning over £6 million a year. I had hired 40 of its 46 staff. I had personally secured the contract that saved it in 2009, and the 2 that grew it afterward. And in a room in Leeds, a man I'd never met summarized my adult working life as informal assistance to my husband's family business. And this is the part that took me 2 years to accept. He was, on every single document that existed, completely correct. Let me back up. My name is Rosalind Bellingham. I'm 56 years old, and I gave up my own career, my own city, and my own earnings to rescue and rebuild a business that I was promised, repeatedly for 18 years, would be partly mine. It was never partly mine. Not for one day. And the reason it was never partly mine is that every time the paperwork came up, and it came up perhaps a dozen times over 18 years, there was a reason to wait. Tax reasons, bank covenant reasons, wait until the restructure. Wait until Dad retires. Wait until the loan's cleared. Next year, Rose. We'll sort it next year. I want to say the thing at the start that I have said to about 9 women since, because it is the entire lesson and it cost me 18 years to learn. Promise that is always about to be honored is not a delayed promise. It is the mechanism. The waiting was not an obstacle to my partnership. The waiting was the arrangement. And I could not see that, from inside, for the better part of 2 decades, because each individual delay had a perfectly good reason attached to it, and because the man giving me the reasons was the man I was married to. Let me tell you who I was before, because that person is the one who got erased. I was 32 when I met Charles. I was a category manager for a national retail group in Manchester. Good at it, on a decent salary, 2 promotions in 4 years, the sort of career that was going somewhere without being glamorous. I understood supply chains, margins, and how to negotiate with people who did not want to negotiate with a woman in her 20s. That is what I was. That is the skill set. Remember it, because it becomes the entire point. Charles Hartwell was the son of a family firm in West Yorkshire, Hartwell & Sons, industrial fasteners and fixings, founded by his grandfather in 1953. He was charming and slightly out of his depth, and I liked him enormously. We married when I was 34. And about a year into the marriage, over a bottle of wine, Charles told me the truth about the business, which was that it was dying. I mean that literally. Hartwell & Sons in 2006 was a company that had not changed anything since about 1988. Stock system was a card index. Its pricing had no logic anyone could explain. It had 61 customers, of which 11 accounted for 80% of revenue, and 4 of those 11 had been reviewing their arrangements for months. Its overdraft was at the limit. Its accountant had, that quarter, used the phrase, going concern, in a letter, which is the polite way of saying a company might not survive the year. Charles's father, Douglas, was 68 and would not retire and would not change anything. Charles's brother Martin was in the business and did the same job he'd done at 24. And Charles, kind, decent, well-liked Charles, was sales director, which meant he took customers to lunch. And I sat at our kitchen table and looked at their figures, because Charles had brought them home in a carrier bag, and within about 2 hours I could see 6 things that were wrong and 3 that were fixable immediately. So I said, let me help. I want to be precise about how the arrangement was made, because for 18 years afterwards there was no document, and this conversation is the only origin there has ever been. It happened over about 3 weeks in the spring of 2006, and it involved Charles, his father, and me, in the office at Hartwell's, a room with a Pyrely calendar from 1991 still on the wall. I said I would come in and sort the business out. I said I would leave my job in Manchester, and we would move, which meant giving up my salary, my pension contributions, and a career I'd built over 11 years. And Douglas Hartwell, my father-in-law, 70 at the time, said the sentence that shaped the next 18 years of my life. He said, "You come in and put this right, love, and you'll have a proper stake in it. This is a family firm, your family." "We'll have a proper stake in it." I asked what that meant. I did ask. I want that on the record because she never asked was later part of the case against me. And Douglas said, shares in time once the bank was off their back, and Charles said he'd talk to the accountant about the most efficient way to do it. And I said fine. And I resigned from my job, and we sold my flat in Manchester, and I moved to a village outside Halifax, and I started work on a Monday in September 2006 at a company where I had no title, no contract, and no wage. No wage. That's the piece everybody stumbles over, so let me explain it, because it seemed entirely sensible at the time, and it was the single most damaging decision I have ever made. I didn't take a salary because there was no money to pay one. The company was months from failing, and because Charles was drawing a director's salary that supported us both. Because the accountant said it was more tax efficient for the household if I didn't add a second salary, and because it felt absurd to invoice my own family. I want to be honest about how that decision actually felt at the time, because in hindsight it looks like the act of a fool, and it did not feel like one. It felt like investment. That is the word I would have used in 2006, and it is the word Charles used. We were a couple in our 30s putting everything into a family asset that would be ours. Taking a salary would have meant taking money out of a company that needed every pound, And I was the one who could see, better than anyone, exactly how few pounds there were. I was looking at the cash flow. I knew that a salary for me in year 1 meant not paying a supplier in month 4. And there was something else, which is harder to admit, and which I think is the real reason. Taking a wage would have made me an employee. And I did not want to be an employee. I wanted to be a principal. I had left a good career and moved 200 miles to rescue this thing, and being on the payroll would have felt like a demotion from what I understood myself to be. Absence of a salary was, in my head, evidence of my status. Owners don't clock in. So the very thing that would have protected me, a contract, a job title, a monthly payslip with my name on it, I actually didn't want, because it would have described me as less than I believed I was. 18 years later, a solicitor in Leeds used that exact absence to describe me as nothing at all. That's the trap, and it's a trap that catches competent women specifically. The more seriously you take yourself as a principal, the less you protect yourself as an employee. And if the ownership never arrives, you end up with neither. So for the first 4 years, I worked for nothing. And after that, when the business could have paid me, we got used to it, and the accountant's advice hadn't changed, and by then I was expecting shares, and shares are what you get instead of wages. Except I never got the shares. 18 years of unpaid full-time work at a company that, on the day I left, was worth about £4.5 million. Let me tell you what I actually did, because informal assistance is a phrase invented by a solicitor in 2024 to describe the following. In the first 18 months, I did the emergency surgery. I repriced the entire product range, which had drifted so far that we were selling 9 lines below cost and didn't know it. I renegotiated with our 3 main suppliers, which involved telling one of them, in a meeting Douglas refused to attend, that we would move our business if they didn't improve terms, and they did. I put in a stock system. I cut the range by 1/3. And I dealt with the bank because somebody had to, and Charles came out of the first meeting gray and shaking and said, "You do the next one." I did the next one and everyone for 18 years. In 2009, the year everyone in manufacturing remembers, I saved the company. I'm not being dramatic. Our largest customer, 22% of revenue, went under owing us £140,000. And in the 11 months that followed, I found and won a contract with a rail sector supplier that took 8 months of pursuit, 3 site audits, and a certification process I project managed personally. That contract carried Hartwell's through the recession and was still, when I left, the second largest account on the books. Between 2011 and 2018, I grew it. Turnover went from 1.6 million to 5.4. Staff went from 19 to 46. I hired 40 of them. I introduced the quality accreditation that let us bid for work we'd previously been locked out of. I ran the move to the new unit in 2015. And throughout, I ran the operations. Purchasing, stock, pricing, credit control, HR, the bank relationship, the auditors, the insurers, the certifications. Charles did customers. Martin did, I still could not tell you precisely. Douglas came in 3 mornings a week until 2014 and disapproved of things. Let me give you 3 days out of those 18 years, because she ran operations as a summary, and the summary is what let them erase it. The first is a Tuesday in February 2007, about 5 months in. Our largest supplier had put us on stop, meaning they would ship us nothing until the account was cleared, and we could not clear it, and without their product we could not fulfill about 40% of our orders. Douglas's plan was to ring them and shout. Charles's plan was to hope. I drove to Wolverhampton unannounced and sat in their reception for 2 hours and 40 minutes until their commercial director agreed to see me, and I put a proposal in front of him that gave them a payment schedule. A personal undertaking from me on the phasing and a commitment to consolidate 2 other product lines with them if they held. He looked at me and said, "And you are?" And I said, "I'm the person who's going to be paying you." He took the deal. We shipped that week. Nobody at Hartwell's ever knew how close that came because I didn't tell them, because Douglas would have found a way to be insulted by it. The second is the whole of 2009, which I've mentioned and which I want to put a number on. The rail contract took 11 months to recite. It's a quality accreditation we did not have when I started pursuing it, and a tender document that ran to 91 pages. Most of which I wrote at my kitchen table between 8 at night and 1 in the morning across 6 weeks. Charles attended 2 of the meetings. He was very good in them. Genuinely, he was charming and people liked him, and that mattered. But the reason we were in the room at all was 11 months of work by one person, and that person was not in the room on the day we signed, because somebody had to be at the plant managing an audit. The third is a Thursday in 2016 when I sacked somebody for the first time. A store supervisor who'd been there 19 years and who was stealing, not much, consistently, for a long time. And I did the investigation and the hearing and the dismissal, and he cried, and I went home and was sick. Charles said, "Better you than me, love." Martin said nothing at all. And I have never forgotten that on the day I did the single hardest thing that business ever asked of anybody. I did it with no title, no contract, and no legal authority to do it, because I was the one who would. And everybody knew I was the one who would. Everybody knew. That's the part I keep coming back to. Every supplier knew, every customer knew, the bank knew, the accountants knew, the staff absolutely knew. You could ask any of the 46 people who worked there who ran that company and none of them would have said Charles. I was in the trade simply the person you dealt with at Hartwell's, and on paper I was nothing at all. The promise 12 times. Let me tell you about the partnership, because this is the machine, and I want you to watch how a reasonable delay becomes a 19-year non-event. 2008, I raised it. The bank had just extended facilities on the condition of no change to the shareholding for the term of the loan. Charles said we'd do it when the loan cleared. That was true, the covenant existed. I later saw it, and it was 5 years. 2013, the loan cleared. I raised it. Douglas was ill by then, and Charles said we couldn't restructure the shares while his father was unwell because the shares were still partly his and it would upset him. That was also true, and it was 2 years. 2015, Douglas died. I waited about 6 months and raised it, and Charles said, reasonably, that we were in the middle of the unit move and a share transfer would complicate the finance. Another year. 2016, I raised it and Charles said he'd spoken to the accountant and there was a tax issue with transferring shares in a company that had appreciated and that we should wait for a restructure. He was going to look into an EMI scheme. He did not. 2018, I raised it properly and hard, and we had our first real row about it, and Charles said the sentence I should have heard as an alarm and heard as a reassurance. He said, "Rose, what difference does a piece of paper make? It's all ours anyway. We're married." It's all ours anyway. We're married. 2019, 2020, 2021, COVID and then recovery and each year a reason. 2022, I raised it and Charles got angry, genuinely angry, which was rare, and said that after everything, it was insulting that I needed a legal document to feel secure in my own family. He said Martin would kick off about dilution. He said his father would be spinning in his grave, and I stopped raising it. In 2022, at 54 years old, I stopped asking because I was tired and because every time I asked I was made to feel like a person who did not trust her own husband. I want to say more about what asking cost because from outside it looks so simple, she should have insisted, and from inside each request had a price that got higher every time. The first few times, raising it was neutral, a practical matter. We'd talk about it and agree it would happen and move on. By about the 4th time, there was a tone. A slight weariness in Charles when the subject came up, the way you'd react to partner raising something you'd already dealt with. Not hostile, just tired. And I began, without deciding to pick my moments, to raise it when things were going well, when he was in a good mood, after a good month. Which meant I was managing the request, which meant it had become a favor I was asking rather than a term of an agreement. By about the 8th time, raising it damaged the marriage for a fortnight afterward. There'd be a coolness. And I would find myself, 3 or 4 days later, doing something conciliatory, being especially easy about something, letting something go to get us back to normal. I was paying, socially and emotionally, for having asked for a thing I had been promised. And by the last 2 or 3 times, I was frightened. Not of him, Charles never once frightened me physically or shouted at me, frightened of what raising it revealed. Because each time I asked and was deferred, I got a little bit closer to a question I did not want to answer, which was, what if there is never going to be a stake? And as long as I only asked once every 18 months or so, I could avoid ever fully arriving at it. That's the thing about a promise that's always about to be honored. You are not only being deferred by them. You are deferring yourself, because the alternative is to conclude that you have given 8, then 10, then 15 years to something you will never own. And no one wants to arrive at that conclusion at 50, with no salary history and a mortgage in someone else's name. The not asking wasn't weakness, it was self-protection. I stopped asking for the same reason you stopped checking a symptom, because the checking is worse than the not knowing, right up until the day it isn't. 19 months later, he left me for a woman who worked at our freight forwarder. ACT too. She was never involved. The marriage ended in the ordinary sordid way, and I am not going to dwell on it, except to say that I found out in the ordinary sordid way too, and that the 6 weeks afterward are a blur. What I remember with total clarity is the moment the other thing landed. It was about 3 weeks after he moved out. I was still going into work, because 46 people's jobs did not stop because my marriage had, and because the September order book was the biggest we'd ever had, and I was the only person who knew how to deliver it. And on a Tuesday morning I arrived and my swipe card didn't work. That's how I found out, a card reader. I stood at the door of a building I had found, financed, and moved the company into, and my card beeped red, and Paula on reception came out looking like she wanted to die and said, "Rose, I'm so sorry. I've been told to say Charles will be in touch." I had, that morning, in my bag, the pricing schedule for the Q4 rail contract, which existed nowhere else. I want to describe the fortnight after that card reader, because it contains the most useful thing I learned about how quickly a life can be disassembled when none of it is in your name. The card was Tuesday. On the Wednesday, my company mobile stopped working, which was also the number that 400 customers, 6 suppliers, and every member of staff had for me, and which I had used for 11 years, and which was not mine. 11 years of contacts, gone in an afternoon, because the account was Hartwell's. On the Thursday, my email was disabled. 18 years of correspondence, every negotiation, every supplier agreement, every piece of evidence about what I had actually done, sat behind a password that no longer worked, on a server in a building I could not enter. I had, thank God, forwarded some things to a personal address over the years, in the haphazard way you do, perhaps 4% of it. On the Friday, I discovered that the car was on the company's lease, and I was asked to return it, and I did, because it was not mine. And by the following week, I understood the actual position, that in 18 years I had accumulated no assets whatsoever in my own name from that business. No salary, so no savings from it. No pension. I had stopped contributing in 2006 when I left Manchester and never restarted because we were putting it into the business. No shares, no car, no phone, not even the emails. I had one thing and it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. I had it entirely by accident. A Leverage file at home in a cupboard of bank facility papers from 2009 to 2018. Because in the years when I did those meetings alone, I had kept my own copies, so I'd have them at the kitchen table when I was preparing. Everything else was theirs. That file was in my house. Within a fortnight, the position had formed, and it was total. I was not an employee, so there was no dismissal to challenge. I was not a director, so I had no rights to information. I was not a shareholder, so I had no stake to value. I had no contract, no title, no salary history, and no P60 with that company's name on it for 18 years. And so the family's position, advanced first by Martin, then by Charles, then by their solicitor, and eventually with a straight face by all of them, was that I had never really worked there. Not that I'd worked there and been badly treated. That I had not worked there, that I had, in Martin's phrase at a family gathering that was repeated to me, been about the place. 18 years, 40 of 46 staff hired by me. And here is the thing that made it viable. They were describing the documents accurately. Every fact in their solicitor's letter was true. I had never drawn a salary. I did not appear on any register. I had no contract. A stranger reading the file would conclude exactly what that letter said, and would be right too. That is the trap that women in family businesses walk into, and it is invisible while you're in it. My entire position rested on a promise made in a room with a 1991 Pyrely calendar by a man who was now dead to a woman who was now divorcing his son. 6 weeks after the swipe card, I did the thing that felt obvious and made everything worse. I went to the office and confronted them in front of people. It was a Thursday. I walked in, Paula let me in, which I have never told anyone because I don't want it to have cost her anything. And I went into the main office where about a dozen staff were working, and I said loudly and clearly that I wanted to talk to Charles and Martin about my position in the business. And Martin came out and said, in front of everybody, "Rose, you don't have a position in the business. You've never had a position in the business. This is a private company, and I'm going to have to ask you to leave." And I said something about 18 years, and Martin said the line that went round that building for months afterward, "You were helping your husband. Now you're not his wife." I don't know what you think that entitles you to. You were helping your husband, and the worst part, the part I did not anticipate and that I still find hard to describe, is that the staff didn't say anything. Not one of them. 46 people, most of whom I had personally hired, several of whom I had covered for, promoted, visited in hospital, given advances to at Christmas, and they looked at the floor. Because Martin was now their employer, and I was a woman standing in reception with no legal standing whatsoever, and every single person in that room did the arithmetic in about a second and a half. I want to add one thing about that day, because there was an aftermath to it that mattered more than the humiliation. 4 people contacted me afterwards, privately over the following weeks, in ways that must have felt risky to them. Paula, who had let me in, texted that night to say she was sorry and that everyone had felt sick about it. A man called Errol, who ran our goods in, and who I had promoted twice, rang me from a car park on his lunch break. 2 others wrote. And all 4 of them said a version of the same thing, which was, everyone knows. Everyone in that building knows exactly what you did and who you are, and nobody is going to say it out loud because they need their jobs. At the time that felt like nothing, worse than nothing, almost, because what use is private sympathy, but it turned out to matter enormously for a reason I did not anticipate, because it meant that when I finally had a case, I was not fighting the truth. I was only ever fighting the paperwork. Nobody in that trade, that town, or that building actually believed I had been about the place. Not one person. A lie was purely legal. It lived only in documents and solicitors' letters, and it never once achieved what a lie like that is supposed to achieve, which is to change what people think. Which is why, 2 years later, I have consulting work. The people who hire me now are people who spent 18 years dealing with Hartwells and know precisely who they were dealing with. The paperwork erased me from the company. It could not erase me from the trade, because the trade dealt with me in person. I do not blame them. I want to say that clearly. I have thought about it for 2 years, and I do not blame a single one of them. But I walked out of that building past people I had hired, and nobody said a word. That was the moment I understood the actual nature of what I'd built. I had built something that had no room in it for me, because I had never once made room for myself. My divorce solicitor was a competent woman called Amara Enkemlu, and I went into our 4th meeting with hope, because I had finally understood the shape of my claim. I said, it doesn't matter that I'm not a shareholder, because we're divorcing, and the business is a marital asset, and I get half of everything in a marriage. And Amara said the thing that took my legs out from under me. I need to explain something, and it's going to be difficult. Yes, the value of Charles's shareholding is in principle a matrimonial resource, but Hartwell and Sons is not a business you and Charles built together from nothing. It is a premarital, inherited, 3rd-generation family company in which Charles holds a minority stake alongside his brother, and in which his late father's shares passed under a will. Courts treat inherited and pre-acquired family businesses very differently from assets built during a marriage. There are arguments, significant ones, about the growth in value during the marriage being matrimonial in character. But you need to understand that we are arguing about a share of Charles's minority shareholding, not about the company. You are not a claimant against Hartwell and Sons. You never were. Your claim is against your husband, and it's limited by what he owns. I said, but I built it. I turned over a company that was 4 months from insolvency. And she said, and she was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. I know. And I will run that argument as hard as it can be run, because your contribution goes to the character of the growth. But Rosalind, I have to be honest with you about the ceiling. Even in the best outcome, you are not getting a stake in that business. You are getting a proportion of the value of one man's minority holding, offset against the house, and you will never work there again. And then she asked the question that changed everything, though neither of us knew it yet. She said, is there anything at all in writing, anywhere? Not a formal agreement, I mean anything. An email, a note, a text. Something where somebody other than you refers to your stake or your role. Because right now, the entire promise exists in your memory of a conversation with a dead man. And I said no, because I had looked and there wasn't. I had 18 years of emails, and not one of them said Rosalind is getting shares, because that conversation had only ever happened out loud, in rooms, between people who were married. I want to describe the 11 months after that, because they were the worst of my life, and because I think the shape of them is instructive. I was 55, unemployed, with no employment record for 18 years. Try explaining that at an interview. What have you been doing since 2006? I ran a £6 million manufacturing business. And your job title there? I didn't have one. And who can we contact for a reference? My ex-husband or his brother. I applied for 11 jobs and got 2 interviews, both of which went well until that part. And the money ran out, which people underestimate, and there's a specific mechanism to it that I want to set out, because it is designed this way and it is not an accident. In a divorce, the financially weaker party is weakest precisely when she most needs to be strong. The assets are frozen or contested. The income has stopped. And the other side's legal costs are being paid, in practice, out of a business that continues to trade and generate cash every single day. Charles's costs came out of the company, one way or another. Mine came out of nothing at all, because I had nothing at all. So there's a clock running, and everybody in the room knows it, and it is not running on both parties equally. Every month that passed was a month in which I got closer to having to accept whatever was offered. Their solicitor knew that. I knew it too, and told me so plainly, which I appreciated. And that is what the 4 months of resisting disclosure were actually about. It was not really about whether the bank's file was relevant. It was about whether I could survive another 4 months of proceedings. It was a test of my liquidity, dressed up as a point of law. I got through it on my sister's money, and by selling a car that was mine and buy, at one point, doing 3 weeks of stock-taking work for a firm in Bradford for cash, at 55, having run a £6 million business, because I needed £900. I'm not embarrassed about that anymore, but I was at the time, and the embarrassment nearly made me settle. I had no income at all. The marital assets were frozen in the divorce. I borrowed from my sister, a woman 2 years younger than me, who I had once outturned by double, lending me money for a car repair at 55. And the isolation was total, because my entire social world for 18 years had been that business, and that village, and that family. I lost all of it in about 9 weeks. Charles's mother, who had taken to hospital appointments for 6 years, did not ring me once. There was a stretch around the following February where I did very little except walk. I would leave the house at 9 and walk until 2. My sister rang the doctor eventually. I want to include that, because I have read a great many stories about women in my position, and they never mention that part, and it should be mentioned. What saved me came from a completely unexpected direction, and I want to be honest that I did not find it through cleverness. My son found it. Thomas is 26. He'd worked summers at Hartwell's through his teens and his early 20s, and he knew exactly who ran that company, and he had been quietly furious since the swipe card. And in the November, he rang me and said, "Mom, you know the bank stuff. All those years you were doing the facility renewals. Do the bank have files?" And something in my chest went cold and hot at the same time, because yes, of course they do. Commercial bank keeps a lending file, and a lending file is not just numbers. It contains the bank's own record of its meetings with the borrower, its assessment of the management team, its notes on key personnel in succession and key man risk. For 18 years I had sat in those meetings, and for 18 years the relationship manager had gone back to his office and written up what he'd been told, written up by a third party, contemporaneously. About what the Hartwells said about me in a room to their bank when they wanted money. Getting it took 8 months, 2 solicitors, and a disclosure application, and I want to say a little about the mechanics after all, because the 8 months nearly finished me, and because the reason it worked is worth knowing. The bank would not simply give me the file. Of course they wouldn't. I was not their customer. The customer was Hartwell and Sons Limited, and I had no relationship with the bank at all except that for 18 years I had been the person sitting across the desk from them, which is worth precisely nothing in law. What made it possible was the divorce. Because in financial remedy proceedings, there's a duty of full and frank disclosure, and the court has powers to order disclosure from third parties where documents are relevant to the issues. And Amara's argument was narrow and clever. We were not fishing for the bank's opinion of me. We were seeking documents relevant to a specific, pleaded question, the extent to which the growth and value of Charles's shareholding during the marriage was attributable to matrimonial effort. Charles's side opposed it. Hard. 3 sets of correspondence, an argument that it was disproportionate and speculative, and a suggestion, I remember the phrasing, that the application was an attempt to conduct a forensic archaeology of the marriage. Which, in fairness, it was. But here is the thing that I have thought about ever since. The strength of their opposition was itself information, because at that point I did not know what was in the lending file. I hoped. I had a memory of sitting in rooms and of a relationship manager typing. But I did not know, and they fought it for 4 months at real expense over documents they said were irrelevant. Amara said to me, about 6 weeks into that fight, "Rosalind, people don't spend £12,000 resisting the disclosure of something that helps them." And I hung on to that sentence through the whole of that summer. What matters is what was in it. The first thing was the 2009 facility application, the one made during the recession when we needed the bank to hold its nerve. And in the relationship manager's write-up under management was this: business effectively run on a day-to-day basis by R. Bellingham, wife of C. Hartwell, who is not currently a shareholder, but is described by the family as a future partner in the business. RB has driven the operational turnaround since 2006 and is the key relationship for the bank. Key man risk is concentrated in RB rather than the Hartwell family members, described by the family as a future partner in the business, in 2009, to their bank, in writing. A man with no stake in my marriage, recording what the Hartwells told him when they wanted a facility renewed. The second thing was the 2015 application. For the unit move, the one Charles had told me we couldn't restructure the shares around. And in the credit paper supporting that lending under succession was this. Succession, DH deceased 2015. MH and CH hold shares. The family have confirmed the intention that RB, who manages the business, will be brought into the shareholding once the property finance is bedded in. I'm comfortable that operational continuity rests with RB. The family have confirmed the intention that RB will be brought into the shareholding. And the third thing, the one that finished it, was a file note from 2018, after a facility review meeting, recording a conversation with Charles Hartwell. CH confirmed RB continues to run the operational side, and that a share transfer to RB remains the family's intention, currently deferred for tax reasons. CH indicated this has been the position since 2006. My husband, in 2018, told his bank, in a meeting I was not in, that the promise had existed since 2006 and was still the family's intention. And then in 2024, his solicitor wrote a letter saying I had provided informal assistance. There was one more piece, and it was Amara who spotted its significance. She said, "This isn't just evidence of a promise, which would be difficult to enforce anyway. Look at what it actually establishes for the divorce." The court is going to ask what proportion of the current value of Charles's shareholding is attributable to growth during the marriage, driven by matrimonial effort, versus inherited premarital value. And your husband has told his own bank, in writing, 3 times over 9 years, that you run the business and that the turnaround was yours. She put the papers down. You were never going to win a share of the company, Rosalind. But you have just made every pound of growth in that company since 2006 matrimonial in character, and there is 4 million pounds of it. That was the reframe that won it. Not I was promised shares, which was unprovable and legally weak. But the growth in this company was generated by the marriage, which the family had themselves certified in writing to a bank on 3 separate occasions because they wanted money. It settled before a final hearing, which is what happens when a case turns. There was a moment at the second mediation that I will keep. Charles's solicitor opened much as before premarital family business, minority holding, my client's wife's involvement peripheral. And Amara said, "I'd like to hand up 3 documents. They are extracts from the lending file of my client's husband's own bank, disclosed under order. I'd invite you to read the entries under management and succession." And we sat there while they read. I watched Charles's face while he read a thing he had said in 2018 and had presumably forgotten saying. And he did not look angry or caught. He looked, and I have thought about this a great deal, he looked embarrassed. Like a man at a dinner party who has been reminded of something he said earlier in the evening. And Martin said, "That's the bank's characterization, not ours." And Amara said, "It is the bank's record of your characterization, made in support of applications for facilities which you received. If the representations were inaccurate, that raises a different set of questions I don't think you want to explore." Nobody said anything for about 10 seconds, and that was it, really. There was another 3 months of negotiation and a lot of accountancy, but the shape was decided in those 10 seconds. I want to record what I felt in that room, because it was not triumph, and I have been surprised by that ever since. What I felt mostly was a kind of vertigo, because I was watching 2 men read a document that said, in plain professional English, exactly what I had spent 18 months being told was a fantasy. And the document was not mine. I hadn't written it. I hadn't kept it. It existed because a bank employee, whose name I can barely recall, had a form to complete and completed it accurately. And what went through my head, sitting there, was, this was here the whole time. The whole time. Every night I had lain awake in that 11 months, wondering whether I had imagined the promise, whether I had built my life on a sentence I'd misremembered from a room in 2006. The answer was sitting in a filing system in Leeds in triplicate. Written by a neutral professional, and would have been sitting there whether or not I ever found it. My entire crisis of self-belief had been unnecessary. I had been right the whole time and had spent a year unable to prove it to myself, let alone anybody else. And the second thing I felt, which is uglier and which I will admit to, is that I wanted Douglas to be alive. My father-in-law, who made the promise, who said you'll have a proper stake in it, love your family, I wanted him alive in that room, to be shown what his sons had done with his sentence. It is the only genuine spite I have carried out of all of this, and it is directed at a man who was, of all of them, the one who meant it. Because I do think he meant it. That's the strange grief underneath this. In 2006, a 70-year-old man in a room with a Pyrely calendar looked at his son's wife and made her a promise he intended to keep, and then he got ill and then he died, and the promise died with him, not because anyone tore it up. Because it had never been written down, and the people who inherited it found it inconvenient. The settlement was substantial and confidential. What I'll say is that it was based on a properly argued matrimonial share of the growth in the company's value from 2006 to 2024. That it was a very great deal more than the offer that had been on the table before the lending file arrived, and that I do not have to work again unless I want to. I do want to. I'm 56 and I have consulted for 2 engineering firms in the last year, both of which came to me because people in the trade know exactly who ran Hartwell's. The trade knew all along. It was only the paperwork that didn't. There's one more thing I want to record about the settlement, because I think people misunderstand what winning looks like in these cases. I did not get 18 years back. The money is real and it matters. I'm not going to be precious about money, having spent a year without any, but the settlement is compensation for a share of the growth in one man's shareholding. It is not wages. Nobody has ever paid me for 18 years of work, and nobody ever will, because there is no mechanism in law by which that happens. The state does not recognize what I did as employment. My national insurance record for 2006 to 2024 has a hole in it that will follow me into my pension. And there is no restitution at all for the thing I actually lost, which was a career of my own. In 2006, I was a 38-year-old category manager on a rising track. If I had stayed in Manchester and done nothing remarkable at all, just turned up competently for 18 years, I would by now be a senior operations director somewhere with a pension, a reputation attached to my own name, and a CV that describes it. Instead, I have 18 years of experience that cannot be evidenced, at a company that says I didn't work there, with a reference I cannot request. That is the actual theft, and no court addresses it. The money was recoverable because it was attached to a marriage. Career was not attached to anything, so it simply vanished. I say this to the women who write to me, and about a dozen have, since I started talking about this openly, because they all ask the same question, which is whether it was worth fighting. And my answer is yes, absolutely, fight, get everything you can. But do not expect the fight to give you back what was taken, because what was taken was not principally financial, and the law can only really return the financial part. What you get back is the truth, formally recorded, and enough money to be free. What you don't get back is the 18 years, or the person you would have been. I did not get a stake in the business, and I never was going to. That is the thing I want to be clear about, because there's a version of this story where the wronged woman ends up owning the company, and that is not what happens in real life. Hartwell & Sons is still there. Martin runs it. It is, by all accounts, struggling, which gives me a complicated feeling I am not proud of and will not pretend I don't have. Charles and I do not speak. He has never acknowledged any of it. The last thing he said to me directly at the final mediation was, "You've done very well out of this, Rose. 18 unpaid years, and I've done very well out of this. Thomas is the reason I got any of it, and he's dismissive when I say so." He said, "You told me every year of my childhood that the answer is always in the file. I just asked which file. Here's the last thing. I have thought for 2 years about what actually happened, and the mechanism is this. I was not cheated out of a partnership. I was kept in a state of anticipating a partnership, which is a completely different thing, and which is enormously useful to the person doing it. Because a woman expecting shares next year works like an owner and costs like a volunteer. She takes no salary because she's getting equity. She builds long-term because she'll be there. She doesn't take another job. She doesn't ask for a contract because a contract is what employees have, and she's about to be a partner. The promise wasn't broken at the end. The promise was the tool the whole way through, and every deferral bought another year of an unpaid managing director who behaved like a proprietor. And the reason it worked for 18 years is that every single delay was individually reasonable. The bank covenant was real. Douglas's illness was real. Property finance was real. The tax issue was real. I never once caught them in a lie, because there weren't any lies. There was just an unbroken sequence of true reasons, and I could not see, from inside, that a sequence of true reasons that always produces the same outcome is not a sequence at all. It's a policy. What saved me was not proving the promise. I could never have proved the promise. The only person who made it was dead, and the only witness to it was married to the other side. What saved me was that for 18 years. Whenever the Hartwells wanted money, they told their bank the truth about me, because the bank was lending against my competence, and you cannot get a facility renewed by describing your operations director as your son's wife who is about the place. They told the truth to the people they wanted something from, and the lie to the woman who'd already given them everything. Business effectively run on a day-to-day basis by R. Bellingham, described by the family as a future partner in the business, 2009, in a bank's file. Written by a man whose name I can barely remember, doing his job, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That's what 18 years came down to, not the promise in the room with the Pyrely calendar. Credit paper, in a filing system in Leeds, that nobody in that family ever imagined I'd be allowed to read.